Now, today's arcade ports video is going to seem a little odd for such a basic game, and surely you couldn't possibly get a bad version of Bobble, surely. They must all be pretty good, right? Honestly, it wasn't until I began researching for this video and playing it on various platforms that this theory is in fact inaccurate. After all, you could say the same for Pac-Man, but any knowledgeable retro enthusiast would likely tell you straight up that the Atari 2600 conversion was shockingly bad. Bobble for me has a history. It was one of the games I had for Christmas in 1990 for my Commodore 64 back then, and it was also a version on the NES I would play religiously back in the day. After a recent request to do this video, we are going through the weird and wonderful arcade ports of Taito's 1986 release of Bobble and ranking, as always, from worst to best. To note, Game Boy original version is a different game with different layouts and intro, so that one won't be included in this video. Prior being asked to do this video from a subscriber, I honestly thought that something as basic as Bobble seriously couldn't have a bad version. After all, it's a creature that blows bubbles into cutesy enemies and smashes them afterwards. This seemed like a task for the Apple II conversion released in 1989 by Taito themselves. I get that this computer is a 1970s computer, and that's fine, but if you need to deviate so far away from what it is you are looking to imitate, why bother at all? Firstly, then, the cute introduction with Bub and Bob hovering with that cool music and storyline with bubbles flying around, it's not in this version. Now, that's not a big issue. The big issue is when enemies appear on screen. The first stage, I was actually wondering if the floppy disk image was broken. Then randomly they appeared, two at a time, and every now and again one would totally disappear altogether. I also found myself dying for no reason in this version. The cool game music is gone during the stages, and we get a partially recognizable tune when it skips to the next round, which in itself isn't smooth transition like most other versions. Collision detection is pretty good, and colors are average for this computer. Sprites aren't particularly smooth though, as seen in the gameplay footage. Now, really, what can I say about this Firebird Amstrad CPC release? I will just say it's playable and a big improvement over the Apple II's conversion. This port features no music at all, even between stages, no music. It's just got the annoying sound of jumping. I did notice that there is a fair bit of frame drop when several sprites are present on screen at once. There is also a little bit of flicker on sprites every now and again. The use of colours are nice, as the CPC generally has nice contrasty vibrant colours in its games, although sprites were kind of pixelated. I also noticed that even shooting bubbles seemed very wooden, so to speak, when blowing them out. It just wasn't particularly fun port to play at all, and whilst collecting goodies after smashing into enemies, instead of a cute collecting sound, it sounded like generic shoot 'em up music. Like I say, an improvement over the Apple II version. At least here I only died when actually getting hit. Some of you watching this likely would not know what a BBC Micro is, especially for people outside of Britain. It was an Acorn computer who did a deal with the BBC in the early 1980s for its computer literacy program. I personally used one at school in the late 1980s. Surprisingly, we had a fairly good Firebird port of Bobble here. Is it groundbreaking? No, but just like the Apple II version, considering everything, this is a very good port, and of course by no means an educational game at all. This version even opens up with the introduction with bubbles popping out from the centre of the screen, whereas most ports of the game didn't have this. The letdown for the BBC version is its slow pace. In that I mean its slow frame rate. There is no transition between stages on this port either. Most versions will see Bub and Bob drop down to the next screen or stage. This version loads the next screen, but the music stays consistent without having to stop at all. combination of very fast music with very slow gameplay is a strange mixture to have, to be honest. The music itself is pretty typical Atari ST style, a 16-bit computer which sounds more like an 8-bit computer. So is this game better being slow? Well, no, it does tend to drag a little. At the beginning of each stage, enemies drop down to their positions, which normally gives the player a chance to work out where they are starting from in each level. The Atari ST version seems to increase the waiting time before each stage begins. We also have the border on the right hand side of the screen, and there's actually no Bob waiting for player 2 either in the bottom right hand side. It does drop slightly in frame rate, and most certainly not the best 16-bit computer version of Bobble here. The ZX Spectrum release by Firebird is a real surprise and joy to play. Okay, so it has some cutbacks, which, as always, I say this is acceptable given the ZX Spectrum's hardware limitations. The introduction to this port is missing, and that's not a great deal breaker, but we are, after all, looking for the best overall port of the arcade classic. Not to say this conversion is bad at all. For a Spectrum, it is wonderful to hear very nice music production. Although I did find whenever Bub jumped, it kind of sounded a little bit strange compared to other versions. But this was the 80s after all, and for some reason developers like to give a sound of jumping. It's just the way it was. Obviously, Spectrum is limited to just a few colours simultaneously, but considering all of this, it's a great 8-bit micro port, and it runs so smoothly too, as well as changes to new stages. A real treat for Spectrum users back in 1987. So like I said in the introduction, the Game Boy port is very different to everything else here, and this Game Gear port remains true to the arcade source material. Now, firstly, this is a great portable 8-bit conversion of Bobble, but like most other 8-bit portable games, there has been some sacrifices made due to memory constraints. This might be a little bit nitpicky, but we don't have the border of the gameplay screen on the left and right hand side of the stages in this version, just the top and the bottom. Not a complete deal breaker, but still. Secondly, the transitions between each stage pauses the music for a split second and repeats the music again once that stage starts. And so music isn't consistent, which sounds a little irritating if I'm honest. On the plus side, this is still a really great port and even features a proper introduction, complete with those bubbles too. We also have no Bob on the bottom right hand side for player 2 to start, which is cool. After all, the Sega Game Gear was a one-player affair. This is a version I had as a kid, and regretfully it isn't the best conversion of the bunch here. I must remain pragmatic and focus on everything, so it's kind of a mixture of the Spectrum and Amstrad for this Firebird port, although the music production is of higher quality thanks to the best sound chip of the 80s 8-bit computers, the mighty SID chip. Now realistically, yes, it is a good conversion for reasons of steady frame rate, smooth sprite control, and generally a decent version of play. The sprites, however, do look a little on the larger side, and pixelation is pretty evident too. One noticeable difference with the Commodore 64's Firebird's conversion is there is an abundance of goodies to collect. The jumping sounds aren't so annoying in this version either, and just like a couple of other ports, we have the table on the right hand side. The introduction, however, is semi-complete, although it's missing the shooting bubbles. Now, on first glance, the Commodore Amiga game looks great. Okay, it's got a table or border on the right-hand side, which isn't how it was originally, and Bob isn't animated in the bottom right-hand corner asking for player 2 to join. So we have a couple of cutbacks, which is cool, but the real issue here with the Amiga port is the speed of this game. And for a Bobble veteran like myself, this was simply a speed I haven't ever been used to playing with. The music, of course, is spot on. This is an Amiga game after all, an area where music actually excelled on. We do have an intro too, but no bubbles. It's just a shame about the extreme speed of this version, otherwise it could have landed itself a slightly higher place. Everything else here is great, and it's got very smooth scrolling too. Now, although the IBM PC compatible DOS conversion isn't actually that bad, controller actually feels just a little on the sensitive side, and the game plays at a slightly faster rate too. The music and sound effects are obviously the sounds of that computer era, but that isn't a bad thing. This nice little version of that awesome music works really well here, as the game moved much quicker and to jump was actually up on the joystick rather than having a dedicated action button. It seemed a little alien to me playing it this way. One thing I did notice is that whenever a single enemy remains on screen, they generally turn a different colour before it's speed enough to hunt you down. That wasn't the case here though. Enemies remain the same colour. It is a silky smooth game to play, and it actually surprised me how well it played too. The DOS version also had a border on the right hand side of the screen, which is obviously not how the 1986 original arcade game was. Surprisingly, the Japanese Famicom Disk System conversion features no cute bubbles or sparkly stars within its introduction of the game. Not an utter deal breaker at all, but given this is an old school Nintendo game, cute things like this, especially for its time, should have been included, surely. No Bob waiting for player 2 to join. One thing that really did stick out to me is that the colours used in this Famicom Disk System conversion appear to be fairly darker in contrast compared with everything else here I've tested. Its transitions with consistent music when travelling from one stage to another are there. It plays really well, although there is better ports to cover in this video. The MSX2 1987 conversion direct from Taito is a superb port of Bobble. It's bright and vibrant and also features that full screen rather than having the table on the right hand side like a lot of versions did have. Okay, so no bubbles at the beginning of the game that pop out from the centre of the screen, and we don't have Bob on the bottom right hand side waiting for player 2 to join. The good things with the MSX2 conversion is pretty much everything else. Sound effects are almost spot on with the original arcade game. For example, when bashing into an enemy after being caught with a bubble, the sound is very nice for this, and also picking up goodies which are scattered around the screen sounds really good with the MSX2 conversion. The transition between stages are also very smooth, and so are the sprites themselves. It's a very impressive port on the MSX2. If it wasn't for the sprite flicker and lack of animated bubbles for the introduction, then this childhood favourite of mine would have easily been higher up in this list. But again, we need to be pragmatic. The arcade game didn't flicker, and we need to be nitpicky here really. We are still looking for arcade perfection, remember. In terms of everything, there really isn't much wrong with this version. Like I say, we are being nitpicky. It's definitely a colourful conversion and reeks in Nintendo 8-bit style music of the Bubble tune. Again, Bob is missing in this version. This isn't an absolutely bad version. Like I say, the only reason it's not further up on this list is due to that sprite flicker. An absolute love letter to the original arcade game. This features everything but that two-player Bob in the right-hand side. opens up with a lovely animated introduction complete with bubbles too, and we also get the 4 borders surrounding gameplay area here, unlike its Game Gear counterpart. Sprites move very smoothly and the colours are really awesome too with this Master System version. If you had this version growing up, you were very close to having arcade games in your bedroom or living room. The sound effects are very similar to the source material and sprites aren't overly pixelated. Obviously, the table on your right hand side isn't here either, so we have a full screen too. From what I have played of this version, there is no frame rate issues and sprite flicker doesn't seem to happen with the Master System port of this game. The FM Towns version is near arcade perfect and includes everything from the original 1986 arcade game. We finally have a 2-player Bob sprite waiting to join in the bottom right hand corner, an introduction with flying bubbles and perfect scrolling too. A complete fluid game that even gives us full options in its options menu, which ranges from enabling the original or arcade version, different ratios of gameplay, that's aspect ratio, music and sound effects options. This 1990 release, brought to us by Ving, included everything and more for our beloved arcade platformer. Now right here I decided to rank the PlayStation 1 and Sega Saturn ports together because frankly when these released in the mid 1990s the hardware wasn't particularly a struggle to get these games running, given that both platforms were actually 32-bit. In terms of perfection, these can be a little over-perfected to the point where sprites look a little more enhanced. I felt that ranking these separately would seem pointless because they virtually look and play the same. Of course, these ports couldn't make it to first place because we're looking for arcade perfection, and like I mentioned, both of these ports are enhanced, as you can see with the Bub and Bob sprites. I am ranking the Sharp X68000 conversion as the closest we'll ever get to an arcade port. This 1990 release by Tempo was pretty much arcade perfection without needing to enhance the sprites like the PlayStation and Sega Saturn conversions did. This plays just like the original and certainly looks the part too. If these two were actually put together, you would see very little difference. Of course, the Sharp X68000 computer was pretty much the development kit for many Capcom CPS games. However, this is a Taito game after all. The clear best of the bunch and was released during the original releases for Bubble Bobble home ports. So anyways, that's comparing all the different ports of Bubble Bobble. So let me know in the comments which you would have ranked in first place, or do you think the ZX Spectrum or Commodore 64 version deserved a higher spot in this video? As always, behave yourself in the comments, and until next video, thanks for watching.